Hey guys, tonight we're heading into one of the harshest winters of the Second World War, December 1944, deep in the Ardennes forest. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel it, snow drifting down in fat, heavy flakes, smothering everything in a pale blanket. The trees groan under the weight, their branches bending low. Your boots sink into drifts that rise above your ankles, and the cold needles its way through your coat until it feels like it's inside your bones. It should be peaceful, right? A winter wonderland. But not tonight. Tonight, this forest is about to explode. And just to give you fair warning, you probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, as always, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Share your location and local time down in the comments. It's become kind of a tradition for this little community. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that low background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Ardennes rolling hills, thick pine forests, narrow country roads winding through sleepy Belgian villages. To the Allies, it was the perfect place to park exhausted divisions. The fighting in France had been brutal, supply lines were stretched, and everyone thought this region was quiet. Too many trees for big tank battles, too few good roads for rapid movement. A safe sector, in other words. That's why so many green American unit skids, really, some barely out of high school, were stationed here to catch their breath before moving on to what everyone thought would be the war's final push into Germany. But that December morning, the quiet dies in a single instant. You're jolted awake in your foxhole by the ground itself, heaving. At first, you think it's thunder, but the rhythm is too sharp, too steady. Then comes the scream of shells, splitting the air. The horizon blooms orange, and a wall of fire slams into the treetops. You scramble upright, snow flying as you grab for your rifle. Someone's shouting over the chaos, but you can barely hear. The sky has turned into a storm of smoke and metal. It's the German army. Against every expectation, they've massed hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, all concealed in the forest. They launch what would become known as the Ardennes Offensive, the last desperate gamble of a regime running out of time. Columns of infantry in white snow smocks fan out between the trees, rifles slung across their shoulders. Behind them, the rumble of tanks echoes like approaching thunder. Panzer, IVs, Panthers, and even a few Tiger tanks grind forward, their tracks churning the frozen ground. The offensive is designed to split the Allied line, seize Antwerp, and maybe, just maybe, force a peace deal favorable to Germany. At least, that's what Hitler believes. For the men in the foxholes, it feels less like strategy and more like the end of the world. You trudge out of cover, snow crunching underfoot, heart racing with each thud of distant artillery. The visibility is awful. Fog and snow swallow everything beyond 50 yards. You can hear battle breaking out all around you, but can't see where the shots are coming from. Somewhere down the road, German armor is already rolling through startled American positions, scattering them like dry leaves. Historians still argue whether this should have been predicted. The Allies had broken German codes before. They had reconnaissance planes in the air. Some insist the warning signs were their strange movements at night. Intercepted chatter, rail traffic pointing toward a buildup. Others argue the Germans did too good a job of hiding their preparations, using the forest itself as camouflage. Either way, the truth hits you now. No one was ready for this. And here's the quirky part: you'd think armies of this size just collide head-on. But the Germans added a trick straight out of a spy novel. They sent English-speaking commandos behind American lines, dressed in captured U.S. uniforms. These infiltrators changed road signs, gave false directions, and even spread rumors to throw units into disarray. Imagine being a terrified young American GI, driving a jeep down an icy road, and the MP waving you to the left turns out to be a German. The confusion spread far beyond what a handful of infiltrators could realistically achieve. But the fear alone was worth the effort. The result? Panic in the ranks, and commanders unsure of whom to trust. You stumble forward, rifle clutched in frozen hands, and realize how utterly wrong the Allied assumptions had been. This so-called ghost front, a sleepy stretch of forest where soldiers expected boredom, not glory, has become the most dangerous place in Europe overnight. The blizzards hide German advances, the narrow roads funnel American units into kill zones, and the silence of the snow makes every gunshot echo twice as loud. And you're caught in the middle of it. The ground shakes again as another artillery barrage lands somewhere in the forest. Snow tumbling from branches like an avalanche. Somewhere, someone screams. Somewhere else, someone prays. You breathe in icy air that cuts your lungs raw and realize you're living through the start of what will be remembered as one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. The Battle of the Bulge. It's not just a clash of armies. It's weather, terrain, and timing conspiring together to turn the Ardennes into a killing ground. And tonight, with snow falling thicker and the forest echoing with engines and gunfire, you're standing right in the middle of it. You step deeper into the woods, snow crunching beneath your boots, and the sound feels far too loud in this eerie white silence. The trees are tall and close together, their trunks black against the glow of powdery snow. At first, you think the forest itself is quiet, but then you realize it's alive with muffled movement. Branches snap under the weight of advancing troops. You hear the distant growl of engines. Somewhere far off, a tank backfires, and the noise ripples through the forest like a warning shot. The Ardennes in winter isn't just a setting, it's a character in the battle. The snow is knee-deep, the cold is brutal, and the sky presses low with gray clouds that blot out the sun. You move carefully, because every step risks giving you away. Visibility is so poor, you can barely make out the outlines of other soldiers ahead of you. You cling to the line, hoping not to get lost. And then there's the smell wood smoke from burning villages, mixed with the acrid temps of explosives. Hanging in the frozen air, you duck into a hollowed-out foxhole where a pair of soldiers huddle, faces red and raw from the cold. One of them looks up at you with wide eyes and mutters, "Where the hell did they all come from?" That's the question echoing across the Allied lines. The Americans thought they'd been facing a beaten enemy. Instead, they're facing divisions that had secretly massed in the woods for weeks, waiting for this very moment. The Germans knew the forest worked in their favor. Thick pines and heavy snow muffled the sound of troop movements, and poor weather-grounded Allied planes that otherwise would have spotted the buildup. Imagine trying to scout from above when the entire world is hidden under clouds and fog. For once, the Germans held the element of surprise. You push forward again, deeper into the trees, and it's not long before the first firefight erupts. Somewhere to your right, a burst of machine gun fire rattles like angry hornets. Men throw themselves flat, snow kicking up around them. You see muzzle flashes blinking between the trees, brief orange sparks against the whiteness. The snow deadens everything except the staccato bark of rifles and the occasional thump of grenades. And then, as suddenly as it started, it's quiet again, leaving only the echoes and the smell of cordite. One mainstream fact worth noting: the Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle the U.S. Army fought in World War II, and indeed, in its entire history. Over 600,000 American troops would eventually be drawn into this frozen struggle, alongside British reinforcements against more than 400,000 German soldiers. Just imagine the entire theater of war condensed into snow-choked valleys and pine forests. But even at this early stage, you can feel the imbalance. The Americans weren't expecting this, and their positions are scattered. Some units are made up of replacements who haven't even fired their rifles in combat before. They're terrified, shivering in too-thin coats, fumbling with weapons that jam when snow gets into the action. Across from them, German veterans surge forward with grim determination, hoping this offensive might somehow turn the tide of the war. You pass an abandoned U.S. outpost, a dugout hacked into the slope of a hill. Inside, blankets and empty ration tins are scattered across the floor. Whoever had been here left in a hurry. On the wall, someone scratched "Merry Christmas" into the timber with the point of a bayonet. It's a cruel reminder. This battle has erupted only days before the holiday. Instead of home, these men are stuck in a freezing forest, listening to artillery instead of carols. And here's a quirky detail: because of the weather and the chaos, soldiers sometimes stumbled into entire groups of the enemy by accident. There are accounts of Americans and Germans colliding in the mist, both equally startled, rifles raised, unsure whether to fire or flee. In some cases, patrols passed each other unseen, separated by nothing more than a wall of falling snow. In a different context, it might sound almost comedic. In this one, it's terrifying. The longer you stay in the forest, the more it feels like a maze. You turn left, right, and suddenly you're not sure where the road is anymore. Compass needles twitch in the cold. Radios don't always work. Historians still argue about whether the Germans actually believed they could win with this offensive. Some say Hitler thought it was his last chance to split the Allies and force negotiations. Others argue the high command knew it was a long shot, but desperation pushed them forward anyway. The debate remains unsettled. Was this a calculated gamble, or just a fantasy born of denial? For you, it doesn't matter. All you know is that men are dying in the snow, and the forest is filling with ghosts. You pause for a moment, leaning against a tree. Your fingers are stiff inside your gloves. The snowflakes sting your cheeks. You can hear someone crying softly nearby, though you can't tell if it's from pain or sheer exhaustion. The forest seems endless, but you know the battle is spreading quickly. Villages are already under siege. Roads are clogged with retreating vehicles. Somewhere, tanks are rolling forward, their treads cutting black scars into the snow. As night begins to fall, the forest grows even darker, the cold even sharper. Fires flicker between the trees, burning houses, shattered trucks, the glow of artillery strikes lighting up the clouds. The smell of pine mingles with the acrid stench of burning fuel. You huddle closer to your unit, trying to keep the fear from settling in your stomach. You remind yourself that the Allies are still strong, that reinforcements will come. But right now, in this frozen forest, it feels like you're standing on the edge of disaster. And then, a simple realization hits you. This battle isn't going to be won in a single day. The Ardennes has only just begun to reveal how brutal it can be. The fog hasn't lifted by morning. If anything, it's grown thicker, turning the forest into a shadowy maze. You move cautiously, each step sinking into wet snow, and your breath hangs in the air like smoke. Somewhere ahead, You hear the metallic clatter of gears and the deep, guttural growl of engines. Then you see them shapes emerging from the mist, hulking and menacing. German tanks, Panthers, Mark IVs, and, if the rumors are true, Tigers, the beasts everyone fears most. The sound alone is enough to make your chest tighten. It's a rhythm like a giant heartbeat, tracks grinding, steel plates clashing. The ground vibrates as the tanks lumber closer, and every soldier instinctively ducks lower. You clutch your rifle, but against armor that thick, it feels laughable, like bringing a slingshot to a bear hunt. The Germans planned this carefully. Their armored divisions spearhead the advance, punching through American positions before the defenders even realize what's happening. Infantry follow in the tanks' wake, pouring down roads once considered impassable. You watch as one column pushes through a gap in the trees, snow swirling around them like a shroud. The tanks are camouflaged in whitewash paint, blending almost eerily into the landscape, as if the forest itself has sprouted iron monsters. American lines crumble quickly. Green units, terrified and inexperienced, break under the sudden pressure. Some soldiers surrender, others scatter into the woods, hoping to survive long enough to regroup. You hear officers shouting, trying to rally the men, but their voices are swallowed by artillery bursts and the grinding of tank treads. Here's a mainstream fact. The Germans actually deployed more than 1,000 tanks and assault guns in the opening phase of the offensive. Many of them concentrated in spearhead units like the 6th Panzer Army. Their goal was bold: smash through the thinly held Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and capture Antwerp. If successful, they would cut off the Allied armies in Belgium and the Netherlands, forcing a political crisis. The Allies had grown confident, even cocky, after pushing across France. Suddenly, that confidence is shattered. The fog helps the Germans more than anyone expected. Allied artillery batteries can't see their targets. Air support is grounded, and units in the woods are effectively blind. You trudge forward with your company, and the mist closes in so tight that even the man a few feet away is just a ghostly outline. Then, without warning, a tank emerges directly ahead, its cannon swinging toward you like a finger of doom. Everyone dives for cover. Snow explodes as the first shell slams into the ground. The concussion makes your ears ring, and clods of frozen earth rain down on your helmet. The machine gun in the tank's hull chatters, spraying fire through the trees. Splinters fly, sharp as knives. You flatten yourself in the snow, hoping the white camouflage of your own fear might be enough to keep you invisible. A quirky detail: some German units actually advanced using captured American vehicles at the front of their columns. Imagine looking down a snowy road, relieved to see what you think is a friendly jeep, only to realize too late it's the enemy driving it. That trick sowed hesitation at checkpoints, sometimes buying critical minutes for German armor to push forward. You glance up and see one of your comrades trying desperately to set up a bazooka. His fingers fumble with the frozen weapon. He finally steadies it on his shoulder, aims, and fires. The rocket streaks through the fog and strikes the tank with a hollow clank. The explosion is small, almost pathetic, leaving just a scorch mark on the armor. The tank turns its turret slowly, almost lazily, and fires again. When the smoke clears, nothing remains of the man with the bazooka. You stay low, heart hammering, as the tanks roll past. Snow covers their tracks almost as soon as they're made, but the fear they leave behind clings like ice. You crawl to the side of the road, hands numb, and listen to the grinding parade fade into the distance. Only when the forest is quiet again do you dare stand. Historians still debate whether the German high command truly believed their armor could break through to Antwerp. Some argue it was pure overconfidence, a fantasy conjured by Hitler himself, who refused to accept that his armies were running on fumes. Others suggest the generals knew it was unlikely, but hoped a temporary victory might at least buy them leverage in negotiations. Either way, the tanks rolling past you now don't look like a fantasy. They look like the hammer of fate itself. The forest begins to fill with wreckage, burned-out trucks, abandoned howitzers, and overturned jeeps line the paths. You pass a group of medics kneeling over a wounded soldier, his leg mangled from shrapnel. They whisper urgently, their voices tight with cold and panic, while the man moans softly, steam rising from his breath in the frigid air. You move on because you have to. You don't dare linger when tanks could return at any moment. As the day drags on, you begin to notice how the snow changes. Fresh powder quickly becomes stained with soot, churned into gray slush under the weight of machines. The purity of the landscape vanishes, replaced by scars of war. You think back to the morning, the stillness, the beauty, and realize that the Ardennes has transformed into something else entirely, a hunting ground. Night falls, but the tanks don't rest. You hear them moving in the distance, their engines growling like predators circling prey. Fires flicker on the horizon, orange against the black sky. The temperature plunges, and you wrap your coat tighter, though it doesn't help much. Around you, men huddle together in shallow foxholes, whispering prayers or jokes that fall flat in the freezing dark. And yet, amid the fear, there's also stubborn determination. You hear an officer muttering, "They won't get Antwerp, not in this snow." You cling to that thought, fragile as it is. Maybe the fog hides German armor now, but it can't last forever. And when the skies clear, the Allies have an advantage the Germans can't match: total control of the air. But that's a hope for another day. Tonight, you're trapped in a forest filled with monsters, iron beasts, moving unseen through the mist. Engines growling in the night. You close your eyes, trying to rest, but the sound follows you, even into your dreams. You wake to silence. Not the comforting kind, but the kind that feels heavy, like the forest itself is holding its breath. Snow lies deep around your foxhole, and the pine branches above bend low under its weight. The air is so cold, it hurts to inhale. Somewhere nearby, a man coughs, the sound hollow in the stillness. You roll stiffly onto your side, brush ice from your coat, and listen, then distant rumbling. Not thunder, not trucks, something larger, deeper. You know what it means. The siege of Bastogne has begun. Bastogne, a crossroads town in southern Belgium, is little more than a cluster of streets surrounded by farmland and forest. But for the Germans, it's everything. Controlling Bastogne means controlling the road network that threads through the Ardennes. Without it, they can't move their armor forward. Without it, their offensive chokes. So they surround it, tighten the noose, and hammer it day and night. You trudge toward the outskirts, joining others who've been sent to reinforce the defense. The town is already scarred, roofs smashed, windows shattered, smoke curling into the cold sky. In the square, soldiers of the 101st Airborne dig in, their coats ragged, boots soaked through. These are paratroopers, tough men who've fought since Normandy, but even they look worn down by the cold. Their eyes are ringed dark with exhaustion. Their lips are cracked from the wind. You pass a group huddled around a barrel fire, hands stretched out like pilgrims before an altar. The fire barely takes the edge off the cold. One of them laughs bitterly and mutters, "Welcome to Bastogne." population frozen. Inside the town, cellars have become bunkers. Families shelter underground, huddled beside soldiers who use the basements as command posts. You crouch in one, lit by a single candle stub. The air smells of damp earth, unwashed clothes, and fear. A Belgian woman presses bread into your hands, thin slices she's saved despite having little for herself. You chew slowly, savoring the taste. It feels almost holy to eat something fresh in this frozen place. Above ground, artillery begins again. Shells scream overhead, bursting in the streets, spraying cobblestones like shrapnel. You duck behind a wall as rubble rains down. Every blast shakes the town, and snow slides from the rooftops in heavy sheets. When the barrage pauses, the silence feels worse. You wait for footsteps, for the clank of tracks, for the next assault. Here's a mainstream fact. Bastogne became legendary because the 101st Airborne, cut off and surrounded, refused to surrender. The German commander even sent a formal demand for capitulation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe scribbled a one-word reply: nuts. That defiance turned the town into a symbol of Allied resilience. A story that spread like wildfire through both armies. But on the ground, defiance doesn't feel heroic. It feels exhausting. You crouch in a ruined house, rifle on your knees, listening to the walls creak in the cold. Snow drifts through gaps in the roof. Your breath fogs the air. Men whisper in the dark, voices rasping from dry throats. You all know the supplies are running low. Food is scarce. Ammunition is rationed. Medical kits are nearly empty. The wounded lie on cots in basements, their bandages stiff with frost. The cold slows the bleeding, but it also steals their strength. Quirky details: some soldiers joked grimly that the cold itself was their best ally. The deep snow bogged down tanks, froze the fuel in their engines, and clogged weapons with ice. One man even swore the forest was on their side, hiding them under its snowy cloak. He grinned through cracked lips and said, "Trees don't pick sides. But I think these ones like us." Nobody laughed. But nobody argued either. Historians still argue whether Bastogne was truly critical to the overall battle, or if its defense became symbolic more than strategic. Some claim the Germans could have bypassed it, moving around the town instead of wasting strength to take it. Others argue its crossroads were so vital that without Bastogne, the entire offensive stalled. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but for you, crouched in that freezing ruin, there's no debate. Hold Bastogne, or die trying. Night falls, and the temperature plummets. You huddle with others in a cellar, wrapping yourself in a threadbare blanket someone found. The candle burns low, casting shadows that dance across the stone walls. You hear distant artillery, then silence, then the whimper of someone dreaming. You think of home, of warmth, of family, of Christmas lights. Instead, you get this: a town encircled by steel, wrapped in snow, suffocating in silence. Still, you cling to the stubborn thought that Bastogne will not fall. That word, nuts, echoes in your mind, a spark of defiance in a winter that seems determined to crush every ember of hope. The morning begins with a bitter irony. You're surrounded by tanks and men, artillery and determination. But what everyone is whispering about isn't the shells or the bullets, it's gasoline, or more specifically, the lack of it. The German offensive was built on speed. Blitzkrieg, remember? Fast-moving columns of armor punching holes through the front, followed by infantry flooding in behind. That was the playbook in 1940, And now, in 1944, they're trying to repeat it. But speed demands fuel, and this time, Germany doesn't have it. You trudge down a snowy road and come across one of the most surreal sights you'll ever see in this frozen war. A column of German tanks stands abandoned in a line, their crews stomping their feet in the snow to stay warm. The engines are silent. The tracks are locked in place. Without fuel, they're nothing more than steel coffins sitting in the cold. One crew has built a small fire beside their Tiger tank, leaning against it like it's a brick wall. They share bread and mutter curses under their breath. All that planning, all that secrecy, and now the machines meant to spearhead the offensive are stranded like stranded whales on a frozen beach. For the Americans, this becomes an unexpected advantage. Patrols whisper to one another. They're running out of gas, and sure enough, you see signs everywhere. Tanks abandoned on roadsides, trucks left with their hoods open, engines dismantled as mechanics desperately search for life. Soldiers trying to siphon every last drop from vehicles, pouring it into jerrycans like liquid gold. Here's the mainstream fact. Fuel shortages were one of the decisive reasons the Ardennes Offensive failed. German planners had assumed they could capture Allied fuel depots as they advanced. But the Allies anticipated this. Retreating American units destroyed their own supplies, setting barrels aflame, smashing pumps, even shooting holes into storage tanks just to keep them out of German hands. You walk past one such depot, a field of scorched barrels, still smoldering. The air reeks of burnt gasoline, sharp and oily in your nose. The ground is blackened, the snow melted away into a slick pool that smells like a mechanic's shop. German soldiers stand at the edge, staring at the wreckage with hollow eyes. You can almost read their thoughts. Without fuel, the dream of Antwerp is already slipping away. Quirky details: some German tank crews hitched horses to their vehicles, trying to drag them across the snow. Imagine the absurdity. A beast designed with 700 horsepower, being pulled by two tired horses like a farmer's wagon. It didn't work, of course, but desperation makes men do ridiculous things. Others tried pushing their vehicles downhill to coast them closer to objectives. A Tiger tank rolling silently down an icy slope isn't exactly subtle, but it shows the lengths they were willing to try. Historians still argue how much the fuel shortage doomed the offensive versus how much Allied resistance did. Some suggest that even with full tanks, the Germans would have struggled against the sheer weight of American industry and manpower. Others counter that, if just one or two panzer divisions had broken through with adequate supplies, the Allies might have been forced into retreat. The debate lingers because it's impossible to separate chance from planning in a battle this chaotic. You take a moment to picture it from the perspective of a German crewman. You've trained for years, fought through France and Russia, survived bombing raids, and now, finally, you're ordered to drive west for the last great victory. And here you sit, frozen beside your useless machine, waiting for fuel that will never come. Snow settles on the turret like a burial shroud. The dream of blitzkrieg dissolves into the reality of cold feet and empty tanks. For you, trudging past these stranded monsters, it's a strange comfort. Every silent engine means one less predator hunting you in the forest. But it's also unsettling. The sight of so much wasted steel scattered across the Ardennes is a reminder that this battle is as much about logistics as bravery. Armies can have all the courage in the world, but without fuel, they grind to a halt as the day drags on. You hear rumors among your unit. Some say German commanders are furious, screaming at supply officers. Others whisper that Hitler himself believed Allied fuel dumps would magically fall into his hands, as if fate owed him a victory. The reality is less mystical. It's just mud, snow, and a lack of planning colliding with Allied sabotage. You march past another stalled convoy, trucks and horse-drawn carts mixed together in a chaotic traffic jam. Soldiers are shouting at one another in frustration. Some smash crates of supplies on the roadside. Others slump in the snow, helmets tipped low, staring into the distance as though their minds have already given up that night. You sit by a small fire with your comrades, pulling your coat tighter as sparks drift upward into the black sky. Someone jokes, "Maybe we should thank Standard Oil for this one." The others chuckle weakly, though their smiles are thin. You all know that without fuel, the German offensive is bleeding out. But that doesn't make your own situation any less miserable. Food is short, the cold is cruel, and the enemy even stranded still fights like a cornered wolf. Still, you can't help but think, the tanks may be mighty, but here in the frozen Ardennes, even they bow to the snow. You're trudging through the snow along a road near the Belgian town of Malmedy when you first hear the rumor. It starts quietly, whispered from one pair of lips to another, passed between squads like contraband. At first, you dismiss it. In war, rumors travel faster than bullets, and most of them are lies. But this one feels heavier, darker, as if the forest itself doesn't want to carry it. The whispers say, American prisoners, were shot. Not in the heat of battle, not by accident, but lined up and gunned down in the snow. You shake your head, trying to brush it off. It doesn't fit the rules you've been taught, the code every soldier carries. Surrender is supposed to mean safety. Once a man lays down his rifle, he's no longer a target. That's what separates war from slaughter, or so you've always believed. But as you march on, the details grow sharper. The story takes shape, piece by piece. Near Malmedy, a group of Americans had surrendered to Waffen-SS troops under Kampfrupp Piper. They were gathered in a field, hands empty, helmets off. Then, without warning, machine guns opened up. Dozens fell where they stood. Some tried to run, slipping on the snow, hunted down like animals. Others dropped into the piles of bodies and pretended to be dead, hearts pounding as boots crunched past. In the end, the field was silent but for the wind. You feel your stomach tighten. You've seen combat. You've seen men die in foxholes, in trenches, in tanks. But this feels different. It isn't battle. It's betrayal. You imagine standing there yourself, your weapon gone, your hands raised, watching the barrels of enemy guns swing toward you. The thought freezes your chest colder than the Ardennes air ever could. Here's the mainstream fact. The Malmedy massacre was one of the defining atrocities of the Battle of the Bulge. More than 80 American prisoners were executed by German forces on December 17, 1944. Survivors managed to escape and spread the word. Within days, every unit in the area had heard. The massacre hardened attitudes, fueling anger and a fierce determination not to surrender. It also became a rallying crying emblem of what was at stake in this bitter winter fight. The rumor ripples through your unit like an electric charge. Men mutter as they clean their rifles, their voices low but sharp. If it's true, we can't let it slide, one says. Another shakes his head. Next time, I'm not taking prisoners. You realize, with a twist in your gut, that the rules of war are shifting beneath your boots. Fear and vengeance are rewriting the code. Quirky detail. In the days that followed, GIs scrawled "Remember Malmedy" on walls, on trucks, even scratched into the stocks of their rifles. It wasn't official orders. It was graffiti born of anger, a message both to comrades and to themselves. Every time you passed the words, chalked or carved in rough letters, it reminded you that war was no longer just about holding lines or taking ground. It was about memory, justice, and the thin line between revenge and survival. You trudge on, snow crunching beneath your boots, but the massacre follows you like a shadow. Every time you pass a group of captured Germans, you feel the air tighten. Your finger itches on the trigger. You glance at the guards, wondering what's going through their minds. Will they show restraint, or will Mamadi haunt their choices, pushing them toward cruelty? Historians still argue about what happened that day. Some say it was deliberate, ordered from above by officers hardened on the Eastern Front, where atrocities were common. Others argue it was chaos, an unplanned eruption of violence, panic, and confusion, snowballing into massacre. The truth is buried in the snow, obscured by time, testimony, and denial. What is certain is the aftermath. Men on both sides knew the rules had been broken, and once broken, rules are hard to piece back together. As the days pass, the massacre becomes a specter in every conversation. You hear it whispered in foxholes, repeated around fires, carried on the wind. Men who were already freezing, starving, and terrified now carry a new weight: distrust. Surrender, once an option in desperation, now feels like suicide. Better to fight until your last bullet than risk standing in that field near Mamadi. You think back to your training, to the neat manuals and tidy lectures about the laws of war. Then you look at the snow around you, littered with bodies, and realize how quickly laws melt when the cold sets in. In the Ardennes, there are no absolutes, only survival and memory. That night, you huddle in a dugout, your coat pulled tight, your hands numb. The wind whistles through the trees, carrying with it the weight of the story you cannot shake. Someone mutters in the dark, "We'll make them pay." No one answers. The silence says enough. The massacre doesn't just change the way you fight, it changes the way you think. Every German uniform looks darker now. Every encounter feels sharper. You know not every soldier pulled a trigger at Mamadi, but you also know that trust is a luxury the Ardennes no longer allows. The snow keeps falling, covering everything: the trenches, the wrecks, the frozen dead. But the massacre doesn't fade. It lingers like a stain you can't bury, a reminder that in this winter forest, the line between soldier and victim is thinner than anyone wants to admit. It's Christmas Eve now, though you wouldn't know it by looking around. The Ardennes offers no carols, no glowing trees, no warm feasts. Instead, you crouch in a foxhole, scraped out of frozen soil, your breath clouding in the bitter air. The snow lies thick over everything, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Every sound is muffled, but not gone the crack of rifles. The distant thump of artillery, the occasional metallic squeal of tank tracks turning somewhere in the dark. You pull your coat tighter and glance at the small tin of rations in your lap. Inside is a single chocolate bar, a sliver of canned meat, and a packet of hard biscuits. Not exactly a feast, but tonight it feels like treasure. The man next to you pulls out a dented sardine tin. How he's saved it this long, you don't know. Together, you share what little you have, passing pieces back and forth with cracked, frozen fingers. There's a strange kind of intimacy in moments like this. You sit shoulder to shoulder with men you barely knew weeks ago, bound together now by frost and fear. One of them hums a Christmas tune under his breath, the melody almost lost in the wind. Another snorts and mutters, "All I want for Christmas is a warm pair of socks." The rest chuckle quietly. Humor, however thin, keeps the cold from swallowing you whole. A quirky detail some G is in the Ardennes actually cut branches from pine trees, stuck them in empty ration cans, and decorated them with scraps of foil from cigarette packs. You can picture it, a tiny, lopsided Christmas tree standing bravely in a foxhole, glittering weakly in the firelight. Even in the middle of war, men grasped at fragments of normal life. Here's the mainstream fact. The 101st Airborne, surrounded at Bastogne, held their lines through Christmas without adequate supplies or relief. General McAuliffe's nuts reply to the German surrender demand had already spread through the ranks, giving the men a rallying cry. But the reality of Christmas was far less heroic: cold, hunger, and a desperate attempt to hold on until reinforcements could arrive. You chew your biscuit slowly, the crumbs sticking to your dry lips. Somewhere far off, you hear a German soldier singing Still No Hot. The melody drifts faintly through the trees, carried by the still night air. For a moment, you pause, recognizing the tune. One of your comrades whispers, "They're singing the same carol we do." The irony is sharp on both sides of the line. Men are cold, hungry, and dreaming of home. Historians still argue about how much morale mattered during the Ardennes Offensive. Some suggest it was decisive, that the stubbornness of surrounded units, the refusal to break, gave the Allies just enough time to recover and counterattack. Others argue that morale was fragile, sustained only by rumors of reinforcements and the hope of clearing skies. What everyone agrees on is that Christmas in the Ardennes was less about celebration and more about endurance. The night deepens. You and your comrades whisper about home. One man talks about his mother's pie, another about the lights strung across his street back in Ohio. You think of your own family, warm in their living room, perhaps gathered around a fire, unaware of how cold you are right now. The contrast hurts, but it also gives you something to cling to. Then, as if to remind you that war never sleeps, the silence is shattered. Mortar whistle overhead and crash into the snowy fields nearby. You throw yourself flat as the blasts thud into the ground, sending snow spraying into the air. Someone shouts, someone else curses, and then the shelling moves further down the line. The snow drifts slowly back to earth, and the forest falls quiet again. You sit up, brushing powder from your helmet, and glance at the sardine tin you shared earlier. It lies empty now, glinting faintly in the moonlight. For some reason, it feels important to remember it. A scrap of metal, a shared meal, a memory of a night when you and your fellow soldiers found a sliver of humanity in the middle of hell. By dawn, the cold has deepened. Your breath freezes against your scarf. The little pine branch one soldier planted in the snow beside your foxhole leans over, heavy with frost. You smile at it anyway. It's absurd, but also defiant. Just like McAuliffe's nuts. Reply. It's a way of saying, yes, we're cold, yes, we're surrounded, but we're still here. By the last week of December, the forest has turned into a graveyard. You march along a narrow road, bordered by fir trees, and you can't help but see them, bodies half buried in snowdrifts, their shapes stiff and unnatural. Arms frozen mid-gesture, as though still reaching for help that never came. The Ardennes claims its own toll, and it doesn't discriminate between German gray or American olive drab. Everyone looks the same when covered in ice. The air smells of smoke, cordite, and something faintly metallic. It lingers no matter where you turn. You kick through a patch of churned snow and uncover a helmet lying on its side, frost clinging to the strap. Nearby, a boot juts from a shallow mound, its leather stiff as stone. You don't stop to look closer. There are too many of them. and staring too long makes you think too hard about your own chances of ending up the same way. You shuffle past a burnt-out tank, its steel hull twisted and blackened. Snow has gathered in the wreckage, covering the jagged metal edges as though trying to soften the scene. But it can't hide the truth. There's a story in every destroyed vehicle, every corpse in the ditch. You imagine men clambering out of that tank as it burned, or maybe not making it out at all. The silence around the wreck only makes it louder in your mind. Here's the mainstream fact. Cold weather claimed almost as many lives in the Ardennes as bullets did. Frostbite, hypothermia, and trench foot ran rampant. Medics were overwhelmed not just with wounds from shrapnel, but with soldiers whose fingers had turned black or whose feet had swollen grotesquely inside their boots. In some units, entire platoons were declared unfit for combat simply because the cold had crippled them. You remember the sardine tin from Christmas Eve, that little spark of camaraderie. Now, it feels like a relic from another world. Tonight, rations are gone, your canteen is frozen solid, and the only thing left in your pocket is a handful of broken crackers. Hunger gnaws at you almost as much as the cold. You see men gnawing on frozen bread so hard it chips their teeth. Some chew on snow just to trick their stomachs into thinking it's full. Quirky detail, there are stories of soldiers warming their hands by tucking them inside the carcasses of dead horses. It sounds like something out of a grim fairy tale, but in weather this cruel, survival demanded desperate measures. Others cut strips of cloth from the dead to wrap around their own boots, scavenging warmth wherever it could be found. The battlefield, already merciless, became a kind of macabre storehouse of supplies. As you walk, you think about how war strips away layers of civility. Back home, you'd have recoiled at the idea of taking anything from the dead. Here, in the Ardennes, it's a practical choice. Gloves are gloves, whether they come from a supply crate or a frozen hand. You don't speak of it aloud, but everyone knows. Historians still debate the exact casualty figures from the cold alone. Some estimate thousands were permanently injured by frostbite, while others argue the numbers are inflated by poor record keeping in such chaotic conditions. What is certain is that every man here feared the snow almost as much as he feared the enemy. One slip, one long night without proper shelter, and you could become another stiff outline under a blanket of white. The deeper you move into the forest, the more surreal it feels. Snowflakes drift lazily down, covering everything with a deceptive calm. A fox darts across the road, its fur bright against the darkness, and for a fleeting second, the war feels far away. But then you hear the groan of a wounded man somewhere in the woods, and the illusion shatters. You can't even find him, his voice fades in and out. Swallowed by the trees. At dusk, you stop to rest near a stone wall half buried in snow. The men with you slump against it, faces hollow, eyes sunken. One mutters, "We're all turning into statues." You know what he means. You feel it in your fingers, your toes, your bones. The cold isn't just outside anymore, it's inside, creeping slowly, threatening to freeze you from within. You watch the snow fall and wonder how many of these bodies will ever be claimed. How many will lie here until spring thaws the forest? Some will be marked and buried. Others will simply vanish under layers of ice, forgotten except by those who walked past them in moments like this. The Ardennes has become less a battlefield and more a mass grave in progress. You keep walking because stopping feels like surrender, but every step is haunted by the stiff outlines in the snow, silent warnings that tomorrow you could be one of them. The first sign isn't the sound of engines or the roar of bombs, it's light. After weeks of gray skies and heavy snow, the clouds finally begin to thin. You notice it while trudging along a narrow road, boots crunching on icy slush, rifle bouncing against your shoulder. At first, it's subtle, a pale shaft of sunlight piercing through the pines, glinting on the frost. Then another. Before long, patches of blue appear overhead. You tilt your head back, blinking at the sky you haven't seen in days. At first, the change feels like a blessing. Clear skies mean warmth, visibility, maybe even a reprieve from the constant dampness. But then the thought hits you. The skies don't belong to you. They belong to the Allies. And that means thunder is coming not from the ground, but from above. The hum begins as a low vibration, easy to mistake for distant artillery. But soon it grows into a steady roar. You glance upward and see dots forming against the pale sky, dark specks at first, then unmistakable shapes. Allied reconnaissance planes glide overhead, circling like hawks. Then larger shadows appear, B-26 Marauders and B-17 Flying Fortresses, lumbering in tight formations, their wings glinting. And lower still, sleek P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons swoop in, sunlight flashing on their canopies. The first strikes come quickly. Bombs fall on convoys, stalled along the forest roads. Explosions ripple through the trees, each one shaking the ground beneath your feet. Flames erupt as trucks loaded with ammunition vanish in clouds of black smoke. Horses scream and bolt from their harnesses, dragging splintered wagons into the ditches. The snow turns gray with soot, littered with twisted steel. You throw yourself flat in a ditch as the next wave arrives. The fighter bombers dive low, their guns blazing, ripping through German columns. The sound is vicious, like the sky itself being torn apart. Bullets stitch the snow around you, snapping branches, kicking up plumes of earth and ice. You bury your face in the frozen mud and pray they don't see you. When you dare to look up again, the road ahead is chaos, burning vehicles, scattered bodies, men stumbling through smoke. Here's the mainstream fact. Once the weather cleared, after Christmas, the Allied air forces seized the skies with devastating effect. More than 1,000 sorties were flown each day. Bombers shattered bridges, cut off retreat routes, and hammered German supply depots. Fighter bombers patrolled roads relentlessly, hunting convoys, tanks, and even lone soldiers. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, could barely mount a response by this stage of the war. Its fuel reserves were gone, its experienced pilots dead or captured. Against the Allies' air supremacy, the Germans were effectively blind and exposed. You stagger back to your feet and keep moving cautiously along the tree line. Every few minutes, another squadron passes overhead. The pattern becomes familiar. The rising whine of engines, the thunder of bombs, then sudden silence. And it's the silence that feels most unsettling. The birds, gone for weeks, suddenly reappear after the raids, flitting nervously through the branches. Their tentative chirping fills the forest in the pauses between destruction, a fragile sound against the devastation. Soldiers notice it too, muttering that even nature seems shocked into silence until the planes have gone. Quirky detail. Some men swore the birds returned louder after raids, as though mocking the battlefield. There are stories of robins perching on the barrels of wrecked tanks, or pecking at crumbs in the snow while vehicles still smoldered nearby. The contrast was almost unbearable, fragile life continuing, indifferent in the middle of industrial slaughter. You creep toward a crossroads and see the toll firsthand. A line of German trucks sits destroyed, their cargoes scattered. Ammunition crates burn in bright flashes as bullets cook off inside. A half-track smolders in the ditch, its metal warped and blackened. Men scramble to salvage what they can, dragging crates into the woods, pulling wounded comrades through the snow. You pause, watching as one soldier smashes open a crate, desperate for food. Another crouches beside a dying horse, stroking its neck before pulling a pistol. The shot rings out, echoing through the trees. Historians still debate how decisive this return of air power truly was. Some argue the German offensive was already doomed by fuel shortages, poor planning, and stiff resistance on the ground. Others maintain the airstrikes were the critical turning point, breaking German morale and severing the fragile supply lines that had held the offensive together. For you, crouched in a ditch with planes screaming overhead, the academic debate doesn't matter. What you feel in your chest is simple. When the skies cleared, the battle changed. By late afternoon, the roads are littered with fresh wreckage. The snow, once pristine, is now blackened with soot, dotted with craters. You step carefully around the wreck of a Panther tank, its turret blown clean off. The smell of burning fuel clings to the air, mixing with the stench of scorched rubber and charred wood. Fires crackle in the distance, glowing orange against the gray trees. The sky above, so recently a cage of clouds, is now alive with circling planes. You and your comrades collapse into a shallow dugout as evening approaches. Your ears ring from the constant roar, and your nerves are frayed. One soldier mutters, "The Luftwaffe's finished." "Haven't seen a German plane all day." Another adds, "Good thing. They'd have to fly on fumes anyway." The others laugh weakly, not because it's funny, but because laughter feels like the only release left. As night falls, the forest grows still again. Smoke from the day's raids drifts lazily through the trees, clinging low to the ground. You sit on your blanket, staring at the sky, where the first stars begin to pierce the haze. The silence now feels different, less oppressive, more resigned. You know the raids will resume tomorrow and the next day, until nothing left of the offensive can stand. You think back to the first days of the Ardennes Offensive, when fog and snow gave the Germans cover, when tanks rolled unseen through the mist, when surprise was on their side. Now the tables have turned. The fog is gone, the skies are open, and the Allies hold every advantage. The offensive that began like a lightning strike is now dissolving under constant bombardment. Quirky, detailed pilots later admitted that the Ardennes was one of the few campaigns where targets were so plentiful they often had to choose which convoys to spare. There was simply too much to hit. From the air, the forest looked like a giant maze of glowing fires, dotted with burning villages and black columns of smoke rising into the blue sky. You lie down at last, trying to rest. But the images won't leave bombs, the flames, the sudden return of birdsong. The Ardennes has shifted again, from ghostly forest battles to a battlefield ruled by the skies. You close your eyes, and even in sleep, the roar of engines follows you. A reminder that once the clouds broke, so did the German offensive. The shelling begins just as you enter the village. The first impact slams into a row of houses, ripping apart the roofs, sending slate tiles tumbling like knives into the street. You dive into the doorway of a cellar, pressing yourself against damp stone as the barrage continues. When the dust clears, and you dare to look out again, the village you stepped into minutes ago already looks like a ruin. This is what it means to be a civilian in the Ardennes. You thought the soldiers had it hard, sleeping in foxholes and gnawing frozen bread. But then you see families emerging from their hiding places, children clutching dolls with missing limbs, old men wrapped in patched coats, women carrying whatever they could grab before the shells fell. Their faces are pale, eyes wide, cheeks raw from the wind. For them, there is no relief, no supply drops, no reinforcements coming. Just another day of hoping the walls don't collapse on top of them. You follow a group into a cellar beneath a bakery. The air is heavy with smoke and fear. The oven has long gone cold, but the smell of flour lingers faintly in the damp. A mother cradles her baby under a blanket, rocking gently even as the ground shakes. An old woman kneels beside her, whispering prayers in French. A boy with wide brown eyes peers up at you, curious and terrified all at once. You nod, but the gesture feels empty. What comfort can you possibly give? Here's the mainstream fact. Belgian and Luxembourgish civilians suffered terribly during the Battle of the Bulge. Entire villages were destroyed by shelling, and many were caught between the shifting lines of combat. Thousands were displaced, driven into cellars, barns, and forests, struggling to survive without heat or food. The Ardennes, which only weeks earlier had been a quiet countryside of farms and timber, became a wasteland. Outside, you see soldiers commandeering barns for shelter. Cows stand huddled in one corner, while men pile hay into makeshift beds. Chickens scatter through the snow, clucking in confusion. A farmer shouts angrily at the intrusion, but his words are drowned out by the next blast of artillery. His home isn't his anymore. It's just another casualty of the front quirky detail in some villages. Civilians marked their houses with chalk crosses, hoping it would signal mercy to passing soldiers. The marks meant different things depending on who looked at them. Don't loot. Children inside, or sometimes simply already searched. Whether they worked is another question. Many houses were looted anyway. Soldiers, desperate for food or warmth, ignoring pleas and prayers alike. You trudge further into the ruins. The church steeple is shattered, its bell lying cracked in the snow. Once, it rang for weddings and harvests. Now, it's just another piece of rubble. You step around a crater in the street. The cobblestones splintered like teeth. Civilians pick through the debris, searching for anything salvageable. A man lifts a scorched pot from the wreckage of his kitchen and stares at it as though trying to remember what it once held. Historians still debate how much responsibility the Germans bore for civilian suffering versus the Allies, whose artillery and airstrikes also reduced villages to rubble. Some argue the German offensive forced this destruction by dragging the front through peaceful towns. Others insist the Allies had no choice but to bomb and shell wherever the enemy held ground. The debate lingers, but for the civilians you see now, it hardly matters. Whether the shells fall from east or west, the roofs still collapse. That night, you sit in a dim cellar beside a family. They offer you a crust of bread, and you break it in half, sharing it with the soldier next to you. Outside, snow drifts silently into the streets, covering the ruins as though trying to hide the scars. For a fleeting moment, it looks almost peaceful, the world softened by white. But the peace is a lie. Tomorrow will bring more shells, more refugees, more lives uprooted as you lie down on the cold floor, staring at the flicker of a candle guttering in the draft. You realize the civilians of the Ardennes don't just endure war, they are swallowed by it. The forest has become a battlefield, their homes trenches, their lives collateral. You wonder if the boy with wide brown eyes will remember this winter, or if the snow will bury the memories along with everything else. The forest feels deceptively quiet now, but the real battle hasn't stopped, simply shifted. Out here, soldiers scrape frost from their rifles and listen for the growl of tanks. But behind the lines, another kind of war hums quietly through radios and telegraphs. You're sent with a detail to deliver messages to a forward command post, and when you arrive, it feels like stepping into a different world inside the farmhouse turned headquarters. There's no gunfire, no smoke, no snow drifting through broken roofs. Instead, you hear the crackle of radios and the constant scratching of pencils against paper. Maps cover the tables, red and blue arrows snaking across the Ardennes-like veins. Young men with round glasses and furrowed brows lean over them, murmuring in low voices, oblivious to the icy drafts sneaking through the windows, that this is the other battlefield, one of listening, intercepting, and guessing. While the soldiers outside shiver in foxholes, these men wrestle with numbers, codes, and fragments of intercepted chatter. You watch one officer jot something down quickly before sliding it across to another, who circles a spot on the map. To you, it looks like scribbles. To them, it's the difference between reinforcement or disaster. Here's the mainstream fact. Allied intelligence, especially the Ultra program at Bletchley Park in Britain, was critical during the Ardennes. By breaking German codes and intercepting radio traffic, they gained glimpses into enemy plans that commanders used to adjust defenses. Combined with reconnaissance reports and field intelligence, this invisible network helped the Allies respond to German moves faster than the enemy expected. You step closer to the radio operators. The room buzzes with static dots and dashes clicking out in rapid bursts. Each fragment might be useless on its own order for ammunition here. A weather report there but pieced together, they sketch the outline of an offensive. The Germans think the snow is hiding their movements, but the airwaves betray them. Quirky detail. Some German messages tried to disguise themselves in ordinary-sounding letters. One intercepted note disguised a unit movement as a family story, with Uncle Karl standing in for a panzer division and the children visiting soon, meaning reinforcements were on the way. The ruse might fool a censor glancing quickly, but not the Allied codebreakers, who had grown adept at reading between the lines. You can almost picture the smirk on a clerk's face when they cracked such a code. Still, nothing about this is simple. Historians continue to debate just how much Ultra truly mattered in the Ardennes. Some argue that without it, the Allies might have stumbled in the fog of war far longer, losing more ground and men. Others claim the intelligence only confirmed what was already guessed on the ground, that fuel shortages and terrain doomed the Germans regardless. For you, standing in that farmhouse, it feels impossible to measure. But it's oddly reassuring to know someone, somewhere, is piecing sense out of the chaos. When you return to the front, you start to notice how invisible hands seem to guide your movements. Orders come suddenly. Dig in here, move there, shift the artillery south. At first, it feels like chaos. Then you realize these shifts are often preemptive responses to German attacks that haven't even landed yet. Someone, hundreds of miles away, has already read the enemy's intentions, and you are a pawn moving on the board because of it. That night, in a dugout, the men talk about it. One says, "Feels like somebody upstairs is reading the enemy's diary." Another mutters, "Long as they don't close the book, the joke gets a tired laugh, but it carries an edge of truth." You all sense that unseen hands are nudging the battle in your favor. The snow keeps falling, covering wrecks, filling foxholes, silencing the forest. But beneath that silence hums an invisible war codes, radios, scribbles on maps. It's easy to forget, in the mud and frost, that the battle isn't only about bullets and bombs. It's about information, timing, and outthinking an enemy as much as outfighting him. And in this winter forest, that invisible war may be what keeps you alive. The maps begin to shift. What was once a deep bulge carved into Allied lines now looks less like a spearhead and more like a shrinking pocket. You don't notice it at first out here in the woods. Every day feels the same, a blur of snow, hunger, and artillery, but slowly. The word spreads. The Germans are losing momentum. You march with your unit along a narrow ridge and hear the distant roar of artillery. Not from your side, but from the Germans retreating under pressure. The Bulge, as it's being called, is collapsing. Roads once clogged with advancing tanks are now filled with wrecks, abandoned vehicles, and scattered corpses. You step carefully between them, boots crunching on ice, rifle slung heavy across your shoulder. At first, your cautious nobody wants to believe the offensive is faltering too soon. But then you see proof. German soldiers trudging west, not in neat columns, but in small, ragged groups, their uniforms ragged, faces pale with exhaustion. Some still carry rifles. Others drag sleds with wounded comrades. They glance at you warily, but don't attack. They're too tired, too beaten down. You realize that the tide has turned. Here's the mainstream fact. By early January 1945, the Allies had regrouped, reinforced, and counterattacked. The German advance stalled for lack of fuel, supplies, and time. Once the skies cleared and Allied air power returned in full, the offensive was doomed. The salient that had threatened to split the Allied armies shrank day by day until it vanished altogether. You push through the snow toward a crossroads that just weeks earlier was hotly contested. Now, it's a graveyard of machines. Half-tracks lie overturned, tanks gutted by bombs, trucks split open like tin cans. You peer into one and see frozen loaves of bread, still stacked neatly in crates. Supplies meant to fuel the drive to Antwerp, now locked forever in ice. Quirky detail soldiers, on both sides, scavenged abandoned vehicles with almost comical desperation. Americans stripped radios and boots from wrecks, while Germans pried rations out of crates left behind. There are stories of men finding bottles of schnapps frozen solid inside trucks, smashing the glass to lick at the icy shards. In this winter, even liquor turned to slush. Historians still argue how much the Germans truly lost by the time the Bulge collapsed. Some say it was catastrophic. Tens of thousands of casualties, tanks and artillery destroyed, reserves wasted. Others note that the Wehrmacht managed to withdraw some units intact, buying time for the defense of Germany itself. But in either case, the offensive had failed in its primary aim. Antwerp was never reached, and the Allies were never split. You crouch in the ruins of a farmhouse, sharing a crust of bread with your squad. The walls are pockmarked with bullet holes, the roof half gone, snow piling in. Someone mutters, "They're finished." Another shakes his head. "They'll fight us in Germany. Don't think it's over yet." Both are right. The Ardennes has been a slaughter, but the war is not done. Outside, the snow glows faintly in the moonlight, revealing tracks where German boots tramped west. You follow them for a while and come across a shallow trench. Inside, a handful of abandoned rifles lie scattered in the frost. Helmets sit empty on the parapet. Whoever was here is gone now, swallowed by retreat. You feel a strange mix of relief and pity. The battle that began as a shocking German offensive is ending in exhaustion and ruin. You think back to those first days' fog surprise, the sudden eruption of tanks in the mist. Now the mist is gone, the skies are open, and the Germans are pulling back, leaving only burned villages and frozen corpses behind as you bed down in a ruined barn that night. You wrap yourself in a blanket scavenged from somewhere, your breath steaming in the dark. For the first time in weeks, you feel a flicker of cautious optimism. The bulge is shrinking, the line is restoring, and perhaps soon you'll be able to leave this forest behind. But you also know the Ardennes will never leave you. Its silence, its snow, its corpses stiff along the roads, all of it will linger, frozen into memory. By now, even the Germans can feel it. The offensive is slipping through their fingers. You trudge through the snow, boots heavy with slush, and hear the muttered conversations among captured prisoners. Their shoulders sag under their coats, their helmets hang low, and though they still cling to rifles when ordered, the fight seems drained from them. The gamble has failed. For the German High Command, this was supposed to be the final throw of the dice. Hitler envisioned a strike that would split the Allies, force them into negotiation, maybe even repeat the miracle of 1940. But by January, the cracks are wide open. Too many tanks left stranded without fuel. Too many divisions battered by Allied counterattacks. Too many villages turned into smoking husks. You don't need to be a strategist to see it. The dream of victory has frozen in the Ardennes. Here's the mainstream fact. The Ardennes Offensive consumed Germany's last reserves of armor and manpower. Elite divisions, including SS Panzer units, were committed and then bled dry. When the offensive stalled, those reserves were gone for good. The Wehrmacht no longer had the strength to mount any large-scale operations on the Western Front. You march past a group of captured Waffen-SS soldiers herded together under guard. They stand stiff, frost clinging to their coats. Some glare with defiance, others stare at the ground. You hear one whisper to another in German, "Es ist vorbei." It's over. The words hang in the cold air, heavier than the snow itself. Quirky detail. In the final days of the offensive, some German officers reportedly burned maps, destroyed documents, and even tore insignia from their uniforms before retreating. They feared being identified, especially SS men, who knew capture meant harsh treatment. Imagine standing in the snow, ripping off the very symbols you once wore proudly, now just a liability in defeat. Historians still argue whether Hitler truly believed in the plan, or if he was simply delusional. By late 1944, some point to his insistence on impossible timetables, demanding divisions march through snow and mud as though the Ardennes were a parade ground. Others suggest his generals enabled the fantasy, too afraid to contradict him. Either way, the men trudging back through the forest now pay the price of that gamble. You stop at a crossroads where a German convoy has been abandoned. Trucks sit tilted in ditches, horses frozen where they fell, sleds piled with supplies left behind. You pull back the canvas on one wagon and find helmets, rifles, even unopened crates of ammunition. All useless now because there's no fuel to move it, no reinforcements to protect it. The offensive isn't just collapsing, it's rotting in place. One of your comrades kicks at the snow and mutters, "They threw everything at us." Everything. You nod. It's true. The Germans committed their best, their last, and now they have nothing left to give. And yet, the war is far from over. A cornered enemy is still dangerous, still capable of lashing out with terrifying ferocity. You can feel it in the forest, in the way every shadow still seems to hide a rifle. That night, you huddle in a barn with a few others. The roof leaks, snow drifting through broken tiles, but at least the walls block the wind. Someone lights a small candle, and the flicker throws long shadows across the hay. The men talk quietly about home, about the end of the war. One says, if this was their last punch, maybe we'll be home by spring. Another shakes his head grimly. Or maybe Berlin will be worse. Neither voice carries much conviction. You close your eyes and think back to those first days of shock the fog. The sudden roar of tanks, the chaos of men running through the snow. It feels like years ago. Now the tanks are burned out husks, the fog lifted, the offensive broken. You realize you've witnessed the last time Germany will ever be on the attack in this war. From here on out, the march is one way into the Reich itself. The forest around you is quiet, but it doesn't feel peaceful. It feels hollow, like the silence after a scream. The Ardennes has taken its toll, and though the battle is ending, you know the memory will remain. A desperate gamble turned to ash in the snow. The road back through the Ardennes is lined with shadows of defeat. You move forward with your unit, but the direction of the enemy is unmistakable, west to east, deeper into Germany. The great push that began with such thunder is now a stumbling, ragged retreat. The snow muffles everything, but not enough to hide the misery. You see men limping on frost-bitten feet, rifles slung carelessly, eyes staring straight ahead with the hollow look of men who have lost too much. In some places, retreat turns into chaos. German units, once so disciplined, break apart into small groups, each scrambling to escape Allied pursuit. Columns of trucks clog the narrow forest roads. Horses strain under overloaded wagons. Men shove one another, desperate to get ahead before the next air raid. You watch from the tree line as Allied fighter bombers scream overhead, strafing the road, scattering men into the ditches. When the planes leave, the survivors climb back out, dragging their comrades along. The retreat never stops, not even for the dead. Here's the mainstream fact. By mid-January 1945, the Ardennes Offensive was in full collapse. German forces, short on fuel and supplies, had no choice but to withdraw under relentless Allied counterattacks. Villages that had briefly flown the swastika were retaken one by one, and the bulge on the map was flattened back to the line it had been before the gamble began. You pass through one such village. The houses are blackened shells, windows shattered, doors hanging from twisted hinges. In the square, a fountain is frozen solid, icicles hanging like daggers from its rim. The only signs of life are a few German stragglers huddled in an alley, too weak to fight, too stubborn to surrender. They melt into the trees when they see you coming, leaving only their footprints in the snow. Quirky details: some German soldiers retreated on bicycles, scavenged from barns and homes. Picture it, exhausted men pedaling through the snow, rifles slung across their backs, trying to outrun tanks and planes on machines meant for country lanes. It would almost be funny if it weren't so tragic. Others lashed sleds together from planks and doors, dragging their wounded through the snow like makeshift ambulances. The retreat was less an organized maneuver and more a desperate scramble for survival. Historians still argue whether the retreat could have been more orderly if German commanders had cut their losses earlier. Some say pride and denial made them cling to ground too long, costing thousands of lives. Others believe the collapse was inevitable, given the Allied advantages in men, machines, and skies. The debate doesn't change what you see: men reduced to shadows of the army they once were, dragging themselves eastward through the snow. You come across the remnants of a German camp, abandoned in haste. Fires still smolder in half-buried stoves. Blankets are left behind, frozen stiff, along with half-eaten loaves of bread. On a table sits a child's toy soldier, wooden and crudely painted, perhaps stolen from a farmhouse. You pick it up for a moment, studying its simple form before placing it back. The irony is sharp, one soldier carved in wood, left behind by thousands of flesh-hand-blood soldiers retreating into the dark dot as night falls. You and your comrades press deeper into the forest. You hear distant artillery your own side, pushing the retreat harder, not letting up for a moment. Fires glow faintly on the horizon, marking the roads where retreating convoys have been hit. The Ardennes, so quiet and still under its blanket of snow, now feels like a funnel, channeling the Germans into a narrowing path of survival. You rest in a barn that evening, sharing a lantern with the others. The roof leaks, snow dripping onto your helmet, but at least the walls keep out the wind. Someone mutters, "They're running now. It's done." Another answers, "Running doesn't mean harmless." Both are right. Even retreating, the Germans leave mines behind, set ambushes, and fight with desperation. Every step forward is paid for in sweat and fear. Before you sleep, you step outside into the cold air. The sky is clear now, filled with stars, and the snow glitters faintly under their light. You listen to the silence, broken only by the crackle of distant fires. For a moment, it almost feels like the war has ended. But then you remember the figures you saw on the roadmen stumbling eastward, refusing to collapse completely. The Ardennes has broken their offensive, but not yet their will to fight. You pull your coat tighter and head back inside. Tomorrow, you'll march again, following the path of their retreat. The forest isn't done with you yet. The Ardennes looks different now. Where once the forest rang with the roar of advancing tanks, now it lies strangely hollow, filled with nothing but ruins and echoes. You march along a ridge where the snow has been churned black by weeks of fighting, and all around you are the scars of retreat. Burned-out panthers sit crooked in ditches, their turrets blown off by direct hits. Half-tracks are wedged sideways against trees, their canvas covers shredded by shrapnel. Even the mighty tigers, once feared more than anything, stand silent, their hulks smothered in snow. It feels like walking through a scrapyard of ambition. Every ruined machine tells a story of how far the offensive reached and how suddenly it died. You climb onto the husk of a panzer, its hatch half open, and peer inside. Frost coats the steel interior. Bullet casings litter the floor. You can almost picture the crew abandoning it in panic, leaving behind their second skin of armor to vanish into the trees. The trenches, too, are deserted now. Snow has filled them halfway, covering helmets, rifles, and torn packs. Some trenches are empty. Others still hold men who never made it out. You look away quickly when you pass those, not out of disrespect, but because the sight is too familiar, too heavy. Here's the mainstream fact. The aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge left the Ardennes littered with thousands of vehicles, weapons, and corpses. It became one of the most cluttered battlefields of the war, a place where advancing Allied forces sometimes had to clear paths through wreckage before moving on. In spring, when the snow melted, the true devastation revealed itself fully, shocking even veterans hardened by years of combat. Quirky, detail local Belgian villagers later scavenged the wreckage for years after the battle. Metal was hauled away for scrap, uniforms turned into work clothes, and wooden rifle stocks cut down into firewood. For a long time, children played in the burned skeletons of tanks, using them as fortresses in their games. What was once terrifying machinery became a playground. Though the ghosts of the Ardennes never really left, you pause near a farmhouse that has collapsed under shellfire. In the courtyard, a rusted bicycle lies half buried in the snow, its frame twisted. Nearby, a single boot sticks out of a drift, unclaimed. The silence presses in, but it doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like a museum without walls, where every object is part of an unfinished exhibit on human cost. Historians still argue about how much the Ardennes Offensive delayed the Allied advance into Germany. Some claim it set back the timetable by weeks, maybe months, buying Germany precious time. Others argue the delay was insignificant compared to the catastrophic losses the Germans suffered. What no one disputes is that the offensive left behind a forest of wreckage that symbolized the futility of Hitler's gamble. You stop at a crossroads where two Sherman tanks sit, engines idling, their crews standing nearby. One soldier leans against the hull, smoking a cigarette, the plume curling upward in the cold air. He gestures at the wreckage all around and says simply, "Hell of a place for a victory." His words hang in the air because you know what he means. The Allies may have broken the offensive, but the Ardennes feels less like triumph and more like endurance. That night, you camp in the shell of a barn whose roof has been blasted away. Snow drifts inside, coating the hay. You and your comrades sit in a circle, passing around a flask someone scavenged from a wrecked truck. The liquor burns as it goes down, but it's warmth, and warmth feels like treasure. Someone mutters, "Think they'll ever clear all this up?" Another answers, "Maybe not in our lifetime." Everyone chuckles, but no one really thinks it's a joke. Before you lie down, you take one last look outside. The forest is quiet, moonlight spilling over wrecked tanks and snow-filled trenches. It looks calm now, almost serene, but you know better. The Ardennes is still a graveyard, its silence built on all the noise that came before. And tomorrow, you'll keep marching, deeper into the ruins of a dream that froze to death in the winter of 1944. The Ardennes is finally fading behind you. But before you leave, you're asked to help with a task no one envies, counting the cost. Not the kind of count a general does in his headquarters, shifting markers on a map. This one is grim, personal, and physical. You move slowly through the forest and villages with a small detail of men, tasked with clearing the battlefield of its dead and taking stock of what remains. The first thing you notice is the sheer scale. Everywhere you look, the snow is disturbed by boots, shells, and bodies. The landscape itself seems to have absorbed the battle. Every tree scarred with shrapnel, every farmhouse riddled with bullet holes. You step carefully, because even now the ground is treacherous land, mines buried beneath drifts, shells that never exploded, weapons frozen in place but still deadly if touched. You pass through a field where dozens of men once fought hand to hand. Now it's just still forms, their outlines softened by snow, their helmets frosted with white. You kneel to adjust a blanket over one, though you don't know his name. It feels like the only decent thing left to do. Here's the mainstream fact: total casualties for the Battle of the Bulge were staggering. Roughly 75,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, and German losses were even highersome. Estimates put them over 100,000. Add to that the civilians caught in the crossfire, and the true human cost becomes nearly impossible to calculate. You walk past a burned-out convoy. Trucks sit blackened and twisted, their cargo scattered. In one, you find crates of helmets that never reached the men who needed them. In another, unopened food tins, burst open now by heat and frost, their contents spoiled. You can't help but think about the men who starved while those crates sat undelivered. Quirky details. Some Allied soldiers joked grimly that the Ardennes would be the best equipped battlefield in history. there was truth in it. Abandoned gear littered every road: rifles, boots, packs, ammunition. Locals would later salvage it all, but for now it sits where it fell. A reminder of how suddenly men had to run, fight, or die. You arrive in a small village that changed hands 3 times during the offensive. The church is gutted, its stained glass windows shattered, the bell missing from its tower. In the square, soldiers line up the dead for burial. They've dug shallow graves in the frozen ground, the work slow and brutal. Picks clang against the earth, sparks flying as the men hack at the frost. Some of the dead are Germans, others Americans. In the end, it doesn't matter much. Death wears the same mask here. Historians still argue about whether the Ardennes was truly worth it for the Germans. Some claim it bought time for the defense of the Reich, delaying the Allied invasion of Germany itself. Others insist it was a catastrophic waste, bleeding reserves dry and hastening defeat. What's undeniable is that the offensive left behind a trail of destruction that would scar the region for decades. You trudge further along the road and see lines of medics escorting wounded men. Some hobble on crutches, others are carried on sleds, improvised from doors and shutters. Their faces are gaunt, eyes hollow, skin gray from frostbite. You overhear one medic say that hospitals in Belgium are overflowing, with cots crammed into hallways and stairwells. Frostbite cases rival combat wounds in number. The war in the Ardennes was fought not just with guns, but with cold. One soldier in your squad whispers about how close it all came. They could have broken through, he says. If they'd reached the Meuse, maybe Antwerp. His voice trails off. You don't need to finish the thought. Everyone knows what it would have meant. A divided Allied army, supply lines severed, perhaps even a pause in the entire war. Instead, what's left is this burned tanks, frozen bodies, and a retreating enemy stumbling back toward the Reich. You pull your coat tighter and head back inside. Tomorrow, you'll march again, following the path of their retreat. The forest isn't done with you yet. The Ardennes looks different now. Where once the forest rang with the roar of advancing tanks, now it lies strangely hollow, filled with nothing but ruins and echoes. You march along a ridge where the snow has been churned black by weeks of fighting, and all around you are the scars of retreat. Burned-out panthers sit crooked in ditches, their turrets blown off by direct hits. Half-tracks are wedged sideways against trees, their canvas covers shredded by shrapnel. Even the mighty tigers, once feared more than anything, stand silent, their hulks smothered in snow. It feels like walking through a scrapyard of ambition. Every ruined machine tells a story of how far the offensive reached and how suddenly it died. You climb onto the husk of a panzer, its hatch half open, and peer inside. Frost coats the steel interior. Bullet casings litter the floor. You can almost picture the crew abandoning it in panic, leaving behind their second skin of armor to vanish into the trees. The trenches, too, are deserted now. Snow has filled them halfway, covering helmets, rifles, and torn packs. Some trenches are empty. Others still hold men who never made it out. You look away quickly when you pass those, not out of disrespect, but because the sight is too familiar, too heavy. Here's the mainstream fact. The aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge left the Ardennes littered with thousands of vehicles, weapons, and corpses. It became one of the most cluttered battlefields of the war, a place where advancing Allied forces sometimes had to clear paths through wreckage before moving on. In spring, when the snow melted, the true devastation revealed itself fully. shocking even veterans hardened by years of combat. Quirky, detail local Belgian villagers later scavenged the wreckage for years after the battle. Metal was hauled away for scrap, uniforms turned into work clothes, and wooden rifle stocks cut down into firewood. For a long time, children played in the burned skeletons of tanks, using them as fortresses in their games. What was once terrifying machinery became a playground. Though the ghosts of the Ardennes never really left, you pause near a farmhouse that has collapsed under shellfire. In the courtyard, a rusted bicycle lies half buried in the snow, its frame twisted. Nearby, a single boot sticks out of a drift, unclaimed. The silence presses in, but it doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like a museum without walls, where every object is part of an unfinished exhibit on human cost. Historians still argue about how much the Ardennes Offensive delayed the Allied advance into Germany. Some claim it set back the timetable by weeks, maybe months, buying Germany precious time. Others argue the delay was insignificant compared to the catastrophic losses the Germans suffered. What no one disputes is that the offensive left behind a forest of wreckage that symbolized the futility of Hitler's gamble. You stop at a crossroads where two Sherman tanks sit, engines idling, their crews standing nearby. One soldier leans against the hull, smoking a cigarette, the plume curling upward in the cold air. He gestures at the wreckage all around and says simply, "Hell of a place for a victory." His words hang in the air because you know what he means. The Allies may have broken the offensive, but the Ardennes feels less like triumph and more like endurance. That night, you camp in the shell of a barn whose roof has been blasted away. Snow drifts inside, coating the hay. You and your comrades sit in a circle, passing around a flask someone scavenged from a wrecked truck. The liquor burns as it goes down, but it's warmth, and warmth feels like treasure. Someone mutters, "Think they'll ever clear all this up?" Another answers, "Maybe not in our lifetime." Everyone chuckles, but no one really thinks it's a joke. Before you lie down, you take one last look outside. The forest is quiet, moonlight spilling over wrecked tanks and snow-filled trenches. It looks calm now, almost serene, but you know better. The Ardennes is still a graveyard, its silence built on all the noise that came before. And tomorrow, you'll keep marching, deeper into the ruins of a dream that froze to death in the winter of 1944. The Ardennes is finally fading behind you. But before you leave, you're asked to help with a task no one envies, counting the cost. Not the kind of count a general does in his headquarters, shifting markers on a map. This one is grim, personal, and physical. You move slowly through the forest and villages with a small detail of men, tasked with clearing the battlefield of its dead and taking stock of what remains. The first thing you notice is the sheer scale. Everywhere you look, the snow is disturbed by boots, shells, and bodies. The landscape itself seems to have absorbed the battle. Every tree scarred with shrapnel, every farmhouse riddled with bullet holes. You step carefully, because even now the ground is treacherous land, mines buried beneath drifts, shells that never exploded, weapons frozen in place but still deadly if touched. You pass through a field where dozens of men once fought hand to hand. Now it's just still forms, their outlines softened by snow, their helmets frosted with white. You kneel to adjust a blanket over one, though you don't know his name. It feels like the only decent thing left to do. Here's the mainstream fact. Total casualties for the Battle of the Bulge were staggering. Roughly 75,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, and German losses were even higher. Estimates put them over 100,000. Add to that the civilians caught in the crossfire, and the true human cost becomes nearly impossible to calculate. You walk past a burned-out convoy. Trucks sit blackened and twisted, their cargo scattered. In one, you find crates of helmets that never reached the men who needed them. In another, unopened food tins, burst open now by heat and frost, their contents spoiled. You can't help but think about the men who starved while those crates sat undelivered. Quirky details. Some Allied soldiers joked grimly that the Ardennes would be the best equipped battlefield in history. There was truth in it. Abandoned gear littered every road: rifles, boots, packs, ammunition. Locals would later salvage it all, but for now it sits where it fell. A reminder of how suddenly men had to run, fight, or die. You arrive in a small village that changed hands 3 times during the offensive. The church is gutted, its stained glass windows shattered, the bell missing from its tower. In the square, soldiers line up the dead for burial. They've dug shallow graves in the frozen ground, the work slow and brutal. Picks clang against the earth, sparks flying as the men hack at the frost. Some of the dead are Germans, others Americans. In the end, it doesn't matter much. Death wears the same mask here. Historians still argue about whether the Ardennes was truly worth it for the Germans. Some claim it bought time for the defense of the Reich, delaying the Allied invasion of Germany itself. Others insist it was a catastrophic waste, bleeding reserves dry and hastening defeat. What's undeniable is that the offensive left behind a trail of destruction that would scar the region for decades. You trudge further along the road and see lines of. At midday, you sit to eat. The rations are as meager as ever, but you force them down. Around you, the forest groans in the wind, branches cracking under ice. It feels almost alive, watching silently as men tally the cost of the gamble played here. You look at the map someone spreads on the ground, the once threatening Bulge, now erased. The line is straight again, the Allied front restored. On paper, it looks neat, almost simple, but out here, where the paper turns into mud and blood, nothing is simple. Quirky detail when the snow finally melted in spring. Farmers plowing their fields often struck metal. Helmets, rifles, even unexploded shells rose to the surface as though the earth itself was spitting them out. Some of those relics still lie buried today, waiting to be uncovered. The Ardennes keeps its secrets longer than anyone intended. That night, you bed down in a ruined farmhouse with your squad. There's no roof left, just beams angled against the sky. Snow drifts in, settling on your blanket. You lie awake, staring at the stars, trying to make sense of it all. The Germans came with tanks and ambition, and now they're gone, leaving only wreckage. The Allies stood, bled, and endured. But victory here feels less like triumph and more like survival. Historians call it the last gasp of Nazi Germany on the Western Front. For you, it feels more like the forest itself swallowed to armies and spat out bones. As you close your eyes, the silence of the Ardennes presses in again. No gunfire tonight, no engines, no shouting, just the whisper of wind through the pines and the memory of what it took to quiet this place again. The forest grows quieter by the day, but silence here never feels clean. It feels heavy, like the weight of snow pressing down on every branch. You walk along a winding Ardennes road that only weeks earlier thundered with tanks and boots. Now it's eerily still, with only the crunch of your footsteps breaking the hush. The battle is over, but its echoes cling to everything: the cracked walls of ruined farmhouses, the burned shells of trucks, and the frozen shapes half buried in the drifts. This is the part of war no one ever wants to remember. The aftermath. When the guns stop but the scars remain. Your orders now are less about fighting and more about searching. You move with a small unit through abandoned positions, looking for stragglers, both living and dead. Some you find crouched in dugouts, too frostbitten to walk. Others you find in silence, staring eyes covered in snow. You learn quickly not to dwell too long on the faces. Here's the mainstream fact. By the end of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was officially declared over. The German offensive had been shattered and Allied lines restored. It marked the last time Nazi Germany attempted a large-scale offensive on the Western Front. From then on, the war would flow only eastward into Germany itself. The Ardennes had been their final gamble, and it ended in defeat. Yet walking through the forest now, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like a massacre that winter itself participated in. Frostbite, hunger, exhaustion, these took nearly as many men as bullets. You pass a group of medics tending to frostbitten feet, wrapping them in strips of cloth, whispering reassurance that rings hollow. The men stare blankly, knowing many will never march again. Quirky detail, you stumble across a snow-covered barn, where someone has scrawled words in chalk on the wall. Remember, Boston. It's not clear if it was left by a German in defiance, or by an American in pride. Either way, the phrase lingers like a ghost in the dim barn light. A reminder that certain places in the Ardennes will forever echo louder than others. You move through the village of Huffelise, or what's left of it. Once a quiet town, it's now a skeleton streets cratered, roofs collapsed, rubble piled in frozen heaps. Civilians wander among the ruins, bundled in rags, their breath fogging in the cold. A woman picks through shattered bricks to find what's left of her home. A boy clutches a scorched toy car, his eyes wide but silent. You want to speak to them, but the words won't come. What could you possibly say that would make sense here? Historians still argue about the long-term meaning of the Ardennes. Some say it delayed the Allied push into Germany, giving Hitler's regime a few more months of existence. Others insist it sealed Germany's fate, draining its last reserves in a pointless gamble. What no one disputes is the human cost: tens of thousands dead, hundreds of villages destroyed, and a forest that would forever carry the weight of memory. At dusk, you set up camp in the ruins of a farmhouse. The roof is gone, so you stare up at a sky clear of clouds at last. The stars glitter, sharp and cold, reminding you of nights long before the war. You lie in your blanket, but your mind refuses to settle. The images return again and again: bodies frozen in ditches, tanks abandoned on the roads, children wandering among rubble. You realize that even when you leave this place, it will follow you. The Battle of the Bulge is over, but the Ardennes will keep whispering its stories long after the snow melts. When spring comes, farmers will find helmets in their fields, weapons buried in the soil, bones hidden beneath the thaw. The war has passed, but its traces are carved too deeply to vanish. Quirky details: some soldiers carved their names into tree trunks before leaving, little more than initials and dates. Years later, hikers would still find them, the scars of knives preserved in bark. Perhaps it was a way to prove they had survived when so many hadn't. Or perhaps it was simply a desperate need to leave something behind, something that wouldn't be erased by snow. That night, you drift toward uneasy sleep. The forest is still, the air biting, the stars clear. For once, no artillery disturbs you. But instead of comfort, the silence feels like a weight, pressing against your chest. You realize the Ardennes isn't quiet because it has healed, it's quiet because it's holding its breath, waiting for someone to remember. This is what echoes after a winter massacre. Not just wreckage and graves, but the memory that human ambition, fear, and defiance collided here, and the snow had to cover the cost. You close your eyes, and though you're leaving the Ardennes behind, you know it will return to you in dreams, as surely as the crunch of boots in the snow.